webinar. We're going to go live on Facebook. And it just takes 45 seconds to get it to go up on Facebook. All right. Good evening, everybody. We are so grateful to have you here for part one of the school reopening series brought to you by Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, the Truancy Intervention Project, and the Georgia Coalition for Equity in Education. I'm Caroline Durham. I'm the Legal and Policy Director for Georgia Appleseed, and I'm really excited for the panel and the discussion that we have today. How are the children? A social justice town hall. Georgia Appleseed is a nonprofit law center that advances justice and equity for all Georgia's children through policy and law reform, community engagement, with a particular focus on Black and Brown children, children experiencing poverty, LGBTQ plus children, children with disabilities, and children in foster care. Georgia Appleseed values include nonpartisan engagement, collaborations to achieve justice like this today, listening to marginalized communities, balanced and objective research, and data-driven pragmatic solutions. Before we get started, I wanted to have touch on a couple of housekeeping matters. We've got our Zoom. You're here with us through Zoom. We are also streaming this live on Facebook and the Truancy Intervention Project's Facebook page, as well as Georgia Appleseed. So reach out to your friends, your family, your community members. They can watch on those pages as well. We've got a Q&A feature so that if you have questions or comments for the panelists, we've got a great team behind the scenes that is watching for your words so that we can lift you into the discussion as well. If you happen to have trouble with the technical stuff, I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'm set up to get notifications when email come through, so please do that as well. With those instructions and those thoughts, I think we're ready to kick this off, and I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Babcock, the Deputy Director of the Truancy Intervention Project.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. We are thrilled to be having this conversation and to have some really wonderful panelists who I think are going to bring a lot to the discussion. We're also looking forward to hearing from you. So as Caroline said, please use the Q&A feature so that we can hear from you. There's an opportunity for us even to pull you in and for you to speak about some of the things that you are seeing and hearing and concerned about. And we do want this to be a really great listening session and discussion as we all move forward into a new school year. So as Caroline said, I'm the Deputy Director of the Truancy Intervention Project, or TIP. We work with children in Fulton County schools and Atlanta public schools who are struggling with attendance. We work with volunteers and social workers to bridge the gap between the difficulties in attending school and getting students back to school. So I am going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we will kick off the discussion. And they will all have an opportunity to tell you more about themselves and their work in a minute. First, we have Cindy Battles, who is the Policy and Engagement Director of the Coalition for the People's Agenda. Julian Fortuna, who is a student organizer of Students for DEI. Wykeisha Howe, who's a program director at Parent Avengers. Christina Wilson Remlin, who is lead counsel at Children's Rights. Garry Simmons, who is a podcaster for Teenish and a leader of Male Dreamers. And finally, last but not least, LaShonda Woods Roberts, who is a staff attorney at Georgia Appleseed and my co-moderator tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to LaShonda.
So glad to be with you all tonight, and I hope you really engage. As you can hear, we're going to keep saying, use that Q&A feature because we want to hear from each and every one of you on this issue because it touches all of us. Before we get into the actual questions and start really discussing some of the implications of social justice or injustice, I wanted to call your attention to our next two events. This is the first of our three-part school reopening series. Our next event is up next Thursday at 12 p.m. and it's Road to 100%, Overcoming the Challenges and Barriers to School Engagement. You see here the registration link. Please notate it or email us, and we'll make sure you get a flyer to send out wide to your networks. The third event is Recovering from the Learning Loss. Available supports for recovery and success. That's going to be September 2nd at 6 p.m. And again, the registration link is here. And in our follow-up materials, we'll make sure you get all the information you need. We have an ask, particularly to our Fulton County residents. At Georgia Appleseed, we work closely with Fulton County CSP program to provide programs like the one we're having tonight, and we need your help. As a part of our funding requirements, we have to report out how many Fulton County residents we engage with during these programs. So if you would be so kind to send us your name and your address, that would help us tremendously. It will be confidential and only used for purposes of confirming your attendance at this event. The email that you can use to send that information is info@gaappleseed.org. Again, that address is info@gaappleseed.org. And we really, really hope that you'll help us out here and send us your name and your address. And if you register with us through Zoom, we already have that information, but in the event that you're watching from Facebook or YouTube or one of our partners' Facebook websites, I really, really want you to use that email address to make sure we get that information and can engage you and send you the follow-up resources from this conversation tonight. All right, so again, in following the theme, please, please, please use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We want to really hear from you. If you want to write down your questions and join us on the panel toward the end of the night, then you can do that as well. But in the meantime, if there's something burning and you want to share it and hear from our panelists, please, please, please use that feature and we'll make sure we address your questions. At the end of the night, we do ask that everyone engages our reopening series event survey. We want to hear from you. When we do programs like this, we want to ensure that we're giving value to our community members, our most important stakeholders, our youth, our caregivers, our families, our partners. So please, please, please engage that survey so we can hear from you when this is all over. And to get us started, we wanted to make sure that we were all on equal footing as it relates to some key terms that will resurface over the course of the discussion. That first one being social justice. If you are at all aware of some of the social justice work going on around us and even throughout the nation, there are a lot of different definitions. We wanted to try to figure out a way to convey and capture what we'll focus on tonight in a simple manner. So we're going to go with this definition. Social justice means to have equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. So that's what we're going with tonight. Another term that's very important to this discussion is intersectionality. And essentially, intersectionality is the interconnected nature of those social categorizations that make us who we are. I'm a Black woman, right? So that's an intersection of being Black, my race, and a woman, my gender. And so we want to make sure that everyone is aware of that term as well as we continue on through the night. And our last term for tonight is school climate, the quality and character of school life. Everyone wants a positive school climate for every child in Georgia. So what does it take to get there and make sure that we're not leaving any kids behind? And that's what this conversation is about tonight. So with no further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand it back to my co-moderator, Sarah Babcock, and we're going to set this thing off.
Wonderful. Thank you, LaShonda. Well, because both TIP and Georgia Appleseed work with and for students, and a student-centered approach is central to the work that both of our organizations do, we felt it was only appropriate to start off tonight by hearing from our two youth representatives, which are Garry and Julian. So we'd like to hear from you first, and sort of the question that we would like to kick things off with is, given everything that has happened in our society over the past 12 to 15 months, so the pandemic, all of the inequities and issues that has raised for youth and for students, as well as the sort of national conversation that we've had around issues of race and policing and racial injustice. How are you all feeling, if you're comfortable sharing that? And what are you hearing from your peers and your friends and fellow students about those issues as we get ready to return to school and go back to some sort of new normal? So I will open with that weighty question. Whichever one of you wants to take it first, please, we're eager to hear from you.
All right. Well, it is a weighty question, but I think that it is helpful to recognize kind of all of the kind of societal events that contextualize these students' return to in-person learning. I think a key thing to recognize with students is that they're a lot more aware, I think, than sometimes adults give them credit for. And they are, as they return to school, going to be grappling with like all of the stuff that they're experiencing, a once in a century pandemic, a climate crisis, a social justice crisis. All of these different kind of issues are going to be kind of front of mind for students. And I think one of the things that they're really going to need more than ever now is an educational environment that is suited to basically a free discussion of these issues, something that allows students the space that they need to pursue in a safe way discussion of these issues with their classmates, people who look like, classmates that may look like them or may not, that might be classmates of different backgrounds, and in a way that is safe, obviously, both academically and like physically. So, how do we make sure that students feel comfortable with the health precautions put in place and making sure that they have the kind of like, maybe it's access to masks or hand sanitizer or whatever it is, that students feel kind of comfortable with those kind of health and safety precautions as well.
Also, with that being said, the mask mandates, because certain schools aren't going by the requirement of wearing a mask, that should be looked into, because it should be still required, especially with this new strain of COVID, and how that is worse than the other one. The mask mandate should be stronger, and most schools are either not requiring masks or are saying that you don't have to wear a mask in general, which I don't agree with. And I personally will be wearing a mask back to school. And it's also during the pandemic, a lot of the online schooling wasn't going really good for a lot of students. And me on that hand, it didn't go well for me. That wasn't my strong point, because virtual learning isn't for everybody. Most people can work with it. Most people can't. Virtual learning is for, depending on how your learning capability is, that'll depend on, okay, if you are better off doing virtual learning, because some people were, but majority of people need more of a hands-on learning, need to be in front of a teacher. So as like me, because being in front of a teacher and being more hands-on, your teacher could help you understand stuff that just give us the teacher just sending you stuff during virtual learning wasn't helping with.
I think that's definitely one thing that I've heard from a lot of my classmates and friends. It's like they were very glad our school transitioned. I go to city schools Decatur, or actually I graduated last month, but I went, and kind of during the year, a lot of people were really struggling with virtual learning, and City Schools of Decatur is a well-resourced school district that was able to provide access to internet, access to learning technologies like computers for students who needed it. And I think that it's definitely top of mind for a lot of students. I think perhaps more so than people realize that like in-person education is something worth like really doing their best to preserve. And so I do hope that students will be more kind of more willing to engage with health measures and kind of take initiative on the health measure side if adults and administrators and teachers are able to communicate to them the kind of link between those health measures and their ability to return to the building in a way that's safe, and that lets them get that kind of support.
Thank you all so much. And let me just, go ahead, Gary.
No, you were good. You're good.
No, go ahead. If you say what you have.
I was only about to say, he has a very strong point. The virtual learning was very difficult, I would say.
And I was gonna say, as adults, some of us, we struggle with, here, take this and run with it. Sometimes we need to engage folks too, in person or even online. So you all are learning lessons that we don't learn far into our career. So y'all are gonna be like far ahead of us. And that it's hard to say what silver linings may come out of this, but you all are learning some extreme lessons that usually come far into when you're in undergrad or already in your career working. So kudos to you all for staying the course. Julian, kudos to you for graduating. Garry, kudos to you for continuing on and matriculating towards your graduation. So I'm excited for both of you, and you're starting up in the fall in person in a safe and healthy way. So just calling attention to the fact that social justice is not a one size fits all, right? Anyone can engage in social justice. And it looks very different from organization to organization, from person to person, community to community. It can be very different, but there is opportunity for anyone to advocate for change, therefore being a social justice advocate of some sort. So I want to pose this question to everyone, no particular order. Can y'all tell us a bit about the work you do as it relates to social justice, and particularly as it connects to school-aged children? What do you do in your work for children? That's what we want to hear about.
I would love to go first. So for me, I'm part of Parent Avengers, and what we do, we help uplift parents to become self-sufficient. And so they're truly connected to the school, because a lot of parents, they work don't allow them to be as engaged as other may. Speaking on the last conversation, I have 8 children. They were all virtual. And I can honestly say they had a very positive experience, because I'm a very hands-on mom, and I have that time to be that way. I don't have to work outside. So it was, I was able to be there. But what I do, and I don't see a lot of people do, I try to help lift up parents, because a lot of people work with the kids, but they don't work with the parents.
So Georgia Coalition for People's Agenda was started by Dr. Joseph Lowry, who, if people are into their history, worked very closely with Martin Luther King Jr. We have 6 focus areas, including voting rights and elections, education, economic justice, environment, and criminal justice reform. What we do kind of depends differently on region to region. On a state and federal level, it is very much policy-based, and making sure, or trying to make sure, that the Georgia State Legislature is fully funding public education and creating policies and adopting curriculum that is equitable and works for all children. On a local level, our coordinators partner with folks on the ground to provide anything that folks might need, right? School supplies, tutoring. We've even done like food giveaways during the pandemic, because we saw, with the loss of school lunches, we saw a huge increase in food insecurity and that sort of thing. So we have it on 3 different levels. And like I said, it's very much hands-on, but looks differently depending on what the community needs.
At Children's Rights, we represent thousands of children in child welfare systems across the country, using impact litigation, policy, and education to try to drive reforms so that they can sleep safely at night and thrive and grow and develop during the day. We know that institutional racism contributes to the disproportionate overrepresentation of Black children in terms of child welfare populations. and an over involvement of Black families in child welfare systems. And so a huge part of the work that we do is to fight to disrupt the unnecessary surveillance, investigations, and separations of Black families. In addition to that, we know that LGBTQ youth are disproportionately overrepresented in child welfare systems as well. And those youth are more likely to be youth of color and exposed to the interlocking risks of discrimination associated with those overlapping identities. And yet, nevertheless, most child welfare systems across the country do not train their workers on how to best serve LGBTQ youth and do not have comprehensive non-discrimination policies and practices in place to protect them. So a huge part of our work is also using policy and education to try to drive reforms that would make these systems safer for LGBTQ youth.
Thank you so much. Julian and Garry, did you all want to respond? And I did want to just call attention to a theme that was ever present in everyone's response, starting with Wykeisha, working with the children and not the parents, and giving them the resources that they can use to support the kids, and expecting the kids to perform in every way without empowering or providing supports to the entire family. That is so important. And thank you all for the work you do and how you respond to the need as opposed to just deciding that this is what needs to be done. Just really hearing the community and responding to what is happening. That's so, so important. Garry and Julian, did you all want to respond to Sarah's question or my question?
Yeah, sure. So I wear a few different hats kind of in the social justice realm. I do a lot of work actually around redistricting, organizing, and kind of uplifting youth voices and underrepresented communities in that area, which, as we'll hopefully get to later, has some intersections with education and kind of education policies actually in a few ways. But in terms of DEI stuff, what I do is with two organizations, Students for DEI and the Decatur Justice Coalition. So the Decatur Justice Coalition is a local organization that I work with, specifically helping to kind of lead curriculum reform efforts within my district with one of my friends who also just graduated, specifically around policies that create responsive curriculum and that empower students to have a kind of voice in the kind of policymaking process of the district in a way that is constructive and platform specifically underrepresented students, so students of color, LGBTQ students, and helps to incorporate students kind of at every aspect of or at least a student perspective in kind of every level of the district's decision-making process, with the recognition that students are most directly impacted by these decisions. With Students for DEI, I'm one of the student organizers for it. Students for DEI is a group that works to advocate for DEI policy kind of across the state in areas like Forsyth, Gwinnett, DeKalb, and focuses a lot on, I guess it varies from area to area, but in some areas it's fighting back against the kind of anti-CRT narrative and the kind of politicization of our education system. And in other areas, it's about building out more affirmative DEI programs and making sure that basically students have a safe environment that they can actually attend school and learn in. So both of those organizations do cool work, and it's a pleasure to work with them. So.
Garry, did you want to talk about any of your social justice initiatives, particularly with the male dreamers group?
A lot of the things we do with Male Dreamers, we're a group located in Savannah. We help out around the city. Sometimes we go out of the state, but out of the city and stuff. But a main thing that we do, we help out the community and people less fortunate, no matter the color, race, whatever. We've done food drives. We've worked downtown. We've done Second Harvest, worked with Second Harvest. We did what we call it care packages, where we went around downtown Savannah and a lot of the local homeless population and dropped off care packages with different things that they could use, regardless of what it was: food, Kleenex, toiletries, anything they could use, toothbrushes, all that, water. anything that would be useful for them. We've done Christmas drives. We've been in parades. Recently, we went to City Hall and got our organization paper signed, saying that we are a part of Savannah. Savannah agrees with us and our organization. And hopefully I think he said we're trying to go and get one in Richmond Hill, then Pooler, and as many other places as we can.
Well, thank you all for sharing all of the tremendous work that you are doing. And we appreciate your willingness to bring all of that to the panel tonight. So another question that we had sort of, and getting each of your unique perspectives and the lens through which you view this, is that as we all know, the past year and a half has been particularly difficult for families. But I think, for those of us who are parents, it's been rough as a parent. And as we've heard from Julian and Garry, it's been difficult in many ways for the children as well, and for students as well. And what we know is that for so many families and children, there was already a lot of inequity and a lot of challenge that they were facing before the pandemic. And now we've really seen this, they talk about as the K-shaped recovery, right? Where the pandemic just took all of those inequities and absolutely blew them up. And so I guess what we would like to hear from each of you is, in the work that you do with different vulnerable or historically excluded communities that have been particularly ravaged by the pandemic, what are some of those sort of exacerbated challenges that you have seen? What has the impact been on those historically excluded communities? And then I guess, to have a little bit of hope, if there's some sort of prescriptive thing that you think should be done, or a particular way that attention could be paid to help. I'm sure all of us would love to hear that as well. And maybe we can go in the same, sorry, go ahead. I was going to ask you to start, Wykeisha, so please go ahead.
So I was just going to say resources. We know there's a lot of resources that have came down the pipeline, but I'll keep it short and sweet. It never got to the communities in which it was intended for. They never received it. And so we have so many families that's struggling to pay their rent, their mortgage, their utilities. We have the seniors that's going, having to choose between rent and medicine or food. We have some kids that don't even get meals. We hear that all the time, like they don't even, get meals at home and stuff that nature. And there's plenty of resources. They're not getting to the people that truly need it.
I love what she just said, because even now when we're seeing new resources like the America Rescue Plan, and there's the you can apply for broadband assistance to pay for your internet, but how many people actually know that? So organizations like ours are trying their best to get this information to communities. But like she said, that even when there were resources, did it get to the people who needed it most? Because one of the things that we noticed about the way the inequities were exacerbated is having access to that information, or having the time. Even when the vaccines came out, remember the way that we were talking about inequity, because getting an appointment took hours and digging, and you literally had to have someone who could just peel through layers of stuff to help you. And I think often of one of the stories that I have from this time frame that kind of exemplifies this for me is being in an Uber and my driver telling me that her partner works third shift and had not lost his job, but she had, but they couldn't be without a second income. They didn't have that money, and the unemployment wasn't coming through the way that it needed to, and people still aren't getting their unemployment. So the idea that people don't want to work because they're getting too much unemployment is ridiculous, but that's a whole other probable webinar. But so she had become a driver. She was driving for Uber and Lyft, and she has a first grade daughter, and her partner was home, but he was asleep because he worked third shift. She's driving, going home and checking on her daughter, and she goes to check on her one time, and the daughter is falling asleep during class in front of her laptop, and the teacher is just sending messages, and they're getting more and more frustrated. So you have a teacher who was frustrated because she can't reach out to the student, parents who feel bad because they feel like they're not parenting their child effectively, and a first grader who's not getting the support and the learning that she needs because of this pandemic, in a state that could have offered resources, but instead decided to cut public education by almost $1 billion because they said they were going to need to save money in a pandemic. And we now have $3 billion in the extra. None of that money is still being spent towards public education. And the state is expecting counties to use the funding that they're getting from the America Rescue Plan to, instead of provide additional resources, fill those budget gaps, right? Like, there's a tremendous amount of things that need to be done for these children as they return to school. And even with all of this, they're still not going to have the money to fund it. And by the way, just to do one more thing, the state legislature actually passed a bill that took money from public education to create scholarships for private schools. Because, again, another way of showing how we are creating an inequitable public education system is how many times they will take that money and give it to public schools where upper middle class or higher level of income children go.
I think in focusing a little bit on our LGBTQ clients, there were some themes of what we heard with respect to the amplified inequities in the time of the pandemic. One, studies have found that conflicts with their families over sexual orientation or gender identity force a staggering 26% of LGBTQ youth from their homes, and 30% of LGBTQ youth have reported physical violence at the hands of a family member after coming out. And so for those young people, having to go home and shelter in place was a very, very challenging experience, really exposing them to elevated risks of abuse and neglect. Also taking that very community out of a school's environment where they used to go face to face and probably or could have had a more supportive, affirming community was kind of a double whammy in terms of loading up their isolation and their more time in a place where they don't necessarily feel safe or comfortable being who they are. And so we definitely heard that. That population has elevated mental health risks because of some of the toxic anti-LGBTQ environment in which they just swim as a normal basis in our society. And so there were real, extremely elevated risks of mental health challenges even going into the pandemic, and then disruptions in their ability to access their mental health treatment in the same way. It's not the same to see your therapist via Zoom. And for some of our young clients, the disruption led to them actually losing the ability to see the therapist. And this is really an environment in which it's not easy for those young people to get connected with an affirming healthcare provider in the first place. And so there were a lot of disruptions that really impacted their health. I think some other themes that other folks have picked up with respect to resources really disproportionately impacted these young people. LGBTQ youth tend to work in the service industry, so a lot of them lost their part-time jobs. They're already a population that's exposed to an increased risk of experiencing homelessness. And in this context of this pandemic, a lot of shelters closed. And so young people were out on the street and used to have a place where they could go, even a youth drop-in center where they could take a shower and get a warm meal and charge their phone. All of a sudden, where they were being met at the door and given a sack lunch and a mask and some hand sanitizer. And so you see a real kind of elevated stress and trauma to them in that context. And so I think I agree with our colleagues that the resource thing is incredibly critical. With respect to education, virtual learning, as Julian and Garry noted, hinges on technology and your ability to actually learn that way, which many people cannot. But for the young people who live in families who are experiencing housing instability, the technological barriers can be profound. And for LGBTQ youth, so many of whom actually are experiencing homelessness and living on the street, the technology is just simply impossible. So I think we really saw a lot of those themes kind of come through in our research and our connections with clients. And I think I agree with the very, very profound initial answer, which is resources need to get to these communities.
Garry or Julian, is there anything that either of you would add in terms of what you have seen in your own communities, among your friends and your peers, about how maybe the pandemic has affected some of them more than others?
So again, I want to preface this with the idea that like the school district that I live in is a very well-resourced school district that didn't, have to fear for a loss of funding, frankly, just because of the way that it's funded from like taxes. But I do think that it is definitely true that there was a hugely disproportionate impact on the way that LGBTQ students and students of color, and frankly, white students, like interacted with each other, I might say. I think beyond even just the idea of access to mental health resources and things like that, that the pandemic and the combination of the pandemic being stuck at home and all of the, protests actually led to a lot of friction between students of, white students and some of our white students, at least, and students of color in the district. And, maybe this, I don't have to go into it too much because this might be better suited for another question, but there were a lot of instances of really like nasty racial incidents, videos of white students using racial slurs, videos of white students going after community members of color, like really profoundly like troubling and distressing things that had a really significant impact on the feeling of safety to students and community members of color, already kind of upended during the pandemic. And so I think that part of the discussion too, as students come back, and a place like where I went to school, is how do, speaking from the perspective of an administrator, how do I, address this problem? How do I actually make it a safe environment for my students to come back and for students of color to learn? And for, how do I instruct white students who more than any group were frankly insulated from the kind of inequitable costs of this pandemic? How do I, kind of meld all of that together into a cohesive and safe school environment? And so I think that that's been something that we noticed a lot, and I can talk more about in a bit, but is definitely a consequence of the pandemic that I think goes, that our community felt very strongly.
Garry, I don't know if there's anything that, you would add.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I was talking to my mother. But hold on.
Sometimes you just have to take a family commercial break, okay?
You gotta love a kid who listens to his mom even through a Zoom.
LaShonda, do you want to go to the next question?
Yeah, so I
will let him. I don't want him to feel time pressure if he's having a
Right.
conversation with his mom.
Okay.
All right.
You ready, Garry? Okay.
Yeah, my mama and my dad, they were asking me about the webinar and everything, how to join. Yeah, okay. But as I was about to say, we were on the topic of racist slang, but as he was saying, I had friends and I was as well. During the pandemic, I had a lot of racial slurs thrown towards me and some of my friends, and especially online. And I knew a couple people who I never thought would even be the type to say stuff like that, who were making videos of them doing racist stuff that they shouldn't have done, and saying things they shouldn't have said.
You sent it to me, not your dad.
Send it to him. Thank you. But what's it called? I had friends who were saying like the N-word towards people and calling them monkeys and stuff like that, who I thought were, okay, like your average person who wouldn't say stuff, who never, like, they were the type that wouldn't say things like that. So I was very thrown off when I heard them say stuff like that. And I saw videos, I heard it, I saw like audio clips of them saying stuff like that, and I was disappointed. I cut them off. I don't talk to them anymore. But when I heard that, I was like, wow, this is something that, one, shouldn't be done, and two, shouldn't have even came out their mouth. And then along with like all the BLM Black Lives Matter movements and all that. Okay, I did say at one point something that would have been thrown off if I didn't correct myself. But at one point I did say I didn't stand for the organization of Black Lives Matter, because they were using the money given towards them for things that weren't regarding Black Lives Matter. So in that matter, I did say I do not stand for them. The Black Lives Matter organization don't stand for it, but the movement itself, I do. Because one, Black Lives do matter. And then the All Lives Matter thing was something that really was throwing me off, because just because we said Black Lives Matter doesn't mean all lives don't matter. It was the fact that at the moment, and still, Black Lives Matter is what stands at the moment. Like, that's what we were talking about. All lives matter, of course, but Black lives are the ones that were racially injustice, were being brought down, everything, bad things all around. The George Floyd incident, of course, was the number one topic, everything else. And with that, there was also students who got expelled, people who got arrested for posting what was called the George Floyd challenge, where they were kneeling on somebody's neck and posting it on social media, on TikTok and everything else. And that wasn't right. There was people who said they were standing for the Black Lives Matter movement who weren't actually standing for the Black Lives Matter movement. They just wanted to do it because everybody else was doing it. And that was a lot of social media influencers doing that. And there was a lot of stuff that shouldn't have been done for that movement that was happening. And I also had a friend who was, during the time of the Black Lives Matter movement, he was in one of the one of the marches. He was in one of the, you know what I'm talking about. But he got pepper sprayed and during the march, and he's okay, but he got pepper sprayed during that, and he had his eye was swollen for I think 2 weeks, and it was crazy.
Yeah, and it's so much to unpack from what everybody just said, but it sounds like, number one, the connectivity and the togetherness at school is a form of accountability, okay? So you can hold your peers accountable when they're right there in your face, but then if they're amongst themselves, or if they don't have that pressure to do the right thing, it can come out in bad ways. And it sounds like also, we got a lot of people with a lot of resources that are presenting themselves as doing a lot of great things, and they're not being good stewards of the community and resources that have been given to them for that purpose. And that's not limited to Black Lives Matter or any other organization. That could be any agency, that can be any school district, that can be any group who are supposed to be good stewards. So we do have to hold folks accountable. So just in that, I think over the course of the pandemic, we've heard and learned, some of us for the first time, the disparities that exist, right? We didn't know that there was such a lack of connectivity for a lot of parts of Georgia. We didn't know that there was such a shortage of devices. There were so many things that came out, particularly even around healthcare access. But for the pandemic, we would have had no idea. I know that Cindy talked about funding. Before we move on really quickly, is there anyone who wanted to say something about how funding and resource inequities contribute to those social injustices that we see? There are resources available, like we've shared all through the night, but they're not getting where they need to go. So are there any examples of how funding and resources could not be getting to where they're going because of lack of dedication or commitment to making sure they get there? Anybody want to talk to any funding pieces before we move on?
I guess just to jump in really quickly, in a district like City Schools of Decatur, I think that there is a lot, there's a lot of self-examination that I think needs to go on in kind of the difference between like verbal support for equity programs, for programs that close these gaps, and financial support for them. And basically the idea that like accountability for your elected officials is really critical, because it's simple to say that you're going to do something and then wait for people to get distracted and then not actually delegate the resources that are required to make the program successful or impactful. And I think that a lot of our kind of school, administrators have begun to realize that and are really like, I think there's a kind of an increasing movement within specifically my district, but I hope other schools as well, really pushing for like concrete investments in these kinds of programs, more so even than just like equity plans or things like that are, yes, important, but require legitimate like commitment to enact and actually make impactful.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things that we need to make sure that we're doing, and I kind of meant to talk about this at a later time or this, I don't know, making sure that we can show up to these local school board meetings, making sure that we're telling the school board and the school administration, make sure your kids know or your parents know. We talk a lot about how we're trying to resource kids and not parents. Make sure parents know about these things and not just putting something in the kid's book bag, because as the mother of 2 teenagers and having cleaned out my son's book bag at one point, you don't get that until like they graduate, right? Like they graduate high school and you're cleaning out the book bag and there's the thing from 9th grade where, yeah. So I think a lot of it is, and I get the fact that it's tiring because we're working and we've got to go to these meetings and stuff like that, but showing up and making sure you're having a say-so in how this funding is getting allocated and making sure you're getting a say-so in how the parents are being informed. Because you're right, there are some resources, and believe it or not, you have a voice in how those can be allocated. I don't ever want to disempower someone's voice. We've seen that. Unfortunately, we've got a funding system where a lot of the ways that schools are funded are from property tax. And we're not going to get in the history of that, why that is. But there have been, in the last few months, several things included in the rescue package that parents can take advantage of that would help them and their students so much.
One thing
I wanted to
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add, when it comes to the school system, I attend all the meetings, and I've been lucky to attend all of the board meetings virtually. But not only do I attend ours, I attend others in other counties and other states just to see how things are ran. And so what I've learned is a lot of our administrations are top heavy. So a lot of the resources go that way versus going to social workers and counselors and things like that. So one of the very disheartening things, I serve on the GO team. Atlanta Public School has a governance team for each school. And so to see that in very poor communities, and I want to clear something up too, because a lot of times we assume Black folks are the only ones that are struggling. That is not true. I have met other families from other races that struggle as well. So back to, the Atlanta Public School being top heavy, a lot of the I say the GO team. We know that the administration part is top heavy. Then we have the GO team that votes on the budget for the individual school. And so we had to share social workers in the poorest communities. So I remember just recently have a conversation with the head social worker of APS and just, helping her understand that come to the community meeting so that you can learn what's going on and figure out how we can work with the families. One thing she said one social worker can make about 400 or 500 referrals, but they never follow up. And that's something that we try to do. We always try to follow up with our families. If you come to us and say you have a need and we refer you out, we circle back around to make sure it works. If it don't work, I have no problem with going to your meeting and say, hey, we sent families there and it didn't work. See, that's something that does not happen. There's no accountability to hold people accountable for who get these resources and say, hey, we're going to do this for the community, the school, and so forth. And they don't do it, and nobody holds them accountable for that. So we try to go and say, hey, you said you hit with housing. This person came to you. What do they need? And we will pre-prep. So we'll make sure you got your social security card, your birth certificate, your ID. We'll pre-prep before we send so that we know when they get to you, hey, they got all their things and they ready to go. But when we see that you're staggering or not doing what you're supposed to do, when we know that you got funding, I have no problem with saying, hey, this is a problem. We need to fix that immediately.
One of the things that Students for DEI has focused a lot on is making sure that there's a student presence at the school board hearings as well. Either, and because it's across the state, sometimes it's about holding people accountable to verbal commitments they make. Sometimes it's about countering, frankly, politicization and political pressure to do the dead opposite of what these people might commit to. We're talking basic assumptions about how our society and our school system should operate. And so having a student presence there, especially if there are any young people listening, I promise you, as a young person, if you show up to a school board meeting, your voice is you would not believe how impactful that is. It is in every system. School board members do not hear from students. Frankly, they don't hear from their constituents almost ever, but especially students. And when you can get a student presence there to push back on the most, on things that you would think would be basic, but are not, basic DEI policies that are the bar that make classrooms an inclusive and open space for students to discuss things the very kind of ground level things. If you can get students there to support that, and if you can be an advocate for that in your community, it has a big difference and it does make an impact. And so that's one of the things that we've seen a lot of with the, anti-CRT debate, is making sure that students are just there to speak for themselves and say, no, actually, we're not being indoctrinated. Actually, what we want is an environment whereby we can all participate and have, a voice in our classroom. So, yeah.
Jumping into what he said on the going to a school board meeting, that is very true. If you go to a school board meeting, they will most likely want to hear from you, because it's very rare to hear from a student at any school board meeting. And if you go, that is very impactful. And the more students you could bring into that, the better, because then they'll hear from y'all and they'll hear the student voice, and they'll most likely listen to what y'all have to say, because what the students have to say is very important. The teachers, their subordinates have to say, that's cool and all, but what the students have to say for themselves is way more important, because if what the students have to say for themselves means that they could talk about anything, like the school lunch, the way the classrooms are, or how the teachers are teaching, and this and the people at the school board meetings, they'll listen, they'll hear what y'all have to say, and they'll go with it.
Absolutely. And I think just one other note about kind of youth engagement on this topic, kids want to be involved with this when you can communicate to them the idea that this is your environment. These are the people who decide how the place where you spend the majority of your waking hours operates. This is you have an opportunity to shift almost any aspect of your education. And so, when, expertise is obviously a very critical thing, and it's important to prioritize that. But in a time with as much kind of change and there, as much a need for rapid response in our education system as now, students are uniquely positioned to provide that kind of input, to provide insight on how do you actually reach young people? How do you actually create the spaces that they need? What are these resources getting, to the point that was made earlier, are these resources actually reaching the student body? Are they reaching, are these resources just being given and not utilized? All of these are really kind of critical things for places for young people to kind of step up. And frankly, I think young people and teachers have a real kind of opportunity to work together in this, because teachers are often, or rather I say often, teachers can be disempowered to enact change in their district as well. And so by uniting with them, you can bring a lot of expertise and authority to the policy. Like, frankly, what are really substantive, in my experience at least, have been really substantive proposals for how the school districts could improve or how they could operate, that young people can bring to the table and that teachers can help provide kind of some expertise or support for. So
Great, thank you all. So shifting gears a little bit, and Julian and Garry already shared some of their experiences around what they saw during the pandemic and sort of what the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent national conversation around racial justice, how they sort of saw that experience among their peers. But I think we wanted to kind of bring the question to everyone and a little bit more directly in terms of, obviously last year had that raised that conversation up and broadened a lot of the work that people were doing or purportedly doing around issues of racial justice in our society. And so, as we're preparing for a return to school for many students, and maybe some kids staying online, virtual, but some going back in person, perhaps going back in person with the classmates who were saying terrible things to them, in the virtual setting. What are some of the things that we might expect to see students talking about and thinking and feeling? And what are some of the things that educators and we as community members can do to create a better environment or to help sort of support students as they return to school with all of those different manifestations of this national conversation going on?
I would say I really hope that everybody can work together. I hope that the teachers partner up with the parents to better take care of the students. A lot of time, everybody works in silos. I don't get this. People are working in silos and we're not getting to the stuff that we need to be taken care of. And so it's so disheartening, but I truly hope that we can partner up together, because I'm a big champion for education and especially my teachers. I love my children teachers. I'm a full believer. If I make sure my baby's teacher's okay, I know that she's going to make sure that my child have a successful day. And it has not failed me. My babies have done well in person and they've done well online virtually. But I really hope we work together. And I've even took the liberty of, because I attend all my city council meetings. I've reached out to the mayor. I reached out to city council. I even reached out to the candidates who are running for mayor here in Atlanta right now, because I truly want us to see, I want to see us work together and not in silos. I think that could better change the way we move and helping the whole city and state of Georgia.
I think that a common theme that we've heard from Julian, from Garry, from Christina is our children are going to be impacted in a mental health way, in big and small ways. We have communities that have lost so many people. We have so kids have dealt with that. They have dealt with being afraid or dealing with not being able to hug people, right? And some in addition to the things that Garry and Julian have shared with us that they've experienced with their peers. So I think mental health counselors is going to be one of the number one things that schools need to invest in. And I'm not talking about the teacher, and I'm not talking about the guidance counselor or the social worker, because they are overworked. And while they have some mental health training, we need actual mental health mental health counselors. I think that's going to go a long way in helping kids connect again to the day-to-day routines, processing what they have experienced, having to reconnect with other students that have treated them in such a racist or heinous manner, helping them to recover from the bullying that they've experienced, and maybe even some social activities. I know recess isn't a thing anymore, but some sort of teaching, because we're all learning. I mean, even as an adult going to an in-person event, I'm having all of this like social trauma and how do I behave now? So teaching, almost reteaching our kids how to engage in that kind of environment. So yeah, I think that that's going to be a huge part of what schools need to invest in. It would probably be, and the school professionals that I've talked to have even said that's like the number one priority right now.
I think a lot of, to the idea too of working in silos, a lot of what we've been pushing for in our district is the creation of programs that can facilitate kind of honest conversations and hopefully what we think to be like healing conversations between not in the sense of like what I fear sometimes these programs can turn into, which is like running PR basically for white students who are racist, which is not at all what we're hoping to, that's not, that should be avoided at all costs, I think. But but starting at the root of the problem and starting kind of when kids are learning how to interact with people who may look like them, who may be different from them, and having people basically trained to facilitate honest conversations and getting student perspective on how you actually do that and what ways they find safe, what ways that they find to be effective. So sometimes what that looks like is sometimes what that looks like is equity training. Sometimes what that looks like is institutionalizing, like, for example, like a rapid response committee to composed of teachers, students, administrators to provide guidance basically for teachers who might be wondering, like, how do I talk about, how do I approach a racial justice protest in a way that actually makes students feel both at once safe and empowered to kind of like share their perspective, like providing guidance and resources by synthesizing everyone's kind of unique experiences and expertise, I think is a really important way to address this. And as administrators, I think a helpful mindset to approach this is there's kind of a two-pronged approach, which is the individual responsibility and the kind of individual capacity you have as a leader to enact these policies. And then the kind of long-term systemic approach, which is the idea that this is also a problem that's broader than any one person, and that to really meaningfully address it will require a kind of systemic district-wide approach that you can do one of those right now, and one of those you can continue to work at for years, and both of those will be to the massive benefit of your students, specifically students of color and LGBTQ students.
Also, following into one thing that Julian said about racism, a big thing about racism isn't something you're born with. That's something that is taught and learned. You have to be taught and trained to say stuff like that or to feel that kind of way. Because you're not just gonna be born and be like, oh, I don't like black people, I don't like white people, I don't like Indians, Haitian, it don't matter, whatever race. That's not just something you just up and, okay, yeah, I don't like them. At a certain point in time, depending on who your family is, whatever or who you hang around, you start to develop that form of learning and thinking. So, for example, if you hang around, let's say if you hang around a bunch of racist people, you're gonna eventually become racist yourself. Unless you try and back away from going towards that way, that might happen. You might be white and start calling every black person you see a monkey, the N-word with the ER, anything, and that's one, not okay. And then on top of that, that's not just something you should say to people, and it doesn't make it okay no matter what. And also, I see that we have a question in the Q&A thing. And what is one way adults can help empower youth voice and give it a larger platform? Julian, you want to take in on that first?
I have a few thoughts on this. Yeah, but Garry, I wanted to just go back to one thing really quick that you were saying, which is the idea that like students aren't, especially young people, like aren't born racist. And it's, I think, really critical that when you're looking at these incidents of racism, that you don't treat it as like the bad decisions of one student, but you take a critical look at everything that led up to that point. And one of the things that we really emphasize with these racist videos is that like, they aren't the entirety of the problem, nor are they necessarily like even the most egregious. They're simply the most like shareable forms of a system that's failed its students repeatedly. And that when you are looking at how you respond to something like that, it's critical to look at things like the curriculum and how it is that you're like the racial, maybe like, what's the word? Maybe, I hate to use the word segregation, but like, frankly, in some places, racial segregation of like gifted programs and, like AP, IB, like things like that. But yeah, so I just wanted to make that point because I think that it's a helpful thing for people to keep in mind that like these kids are a product of their environment in a lot of ways, and that this is their school is that environment.
And not everybody is racist.
Right, yeah, right. And given the proper tools, I think it is safe to say that so many of those students who have done problematic things would have turned out differently were they given a better environment. And it's incumbent on us to provide that as leaders of districts. But sorry, I'm going on. Anyway, so in terms of platforming students, I think that the best way to do that is to look at kind of existing student groups that you can, as either adults or administrators, reach out to and solicit opinions from. So in my district, there's a group called Student Coalition for Equity that was formed in response to those videos. And that group has been kind of the platform for for examining a lot of kind of how our district operates, from people contributing perspectives on curriculum to the disciplinary code to how it is that basically we can institutionalize ways to ask students what they think about policies. And our administrators have been much better at that than they frankly used to be, because I think they're realizing that the need for a responsive curriculum and school environment is so critical now. But really institutionalizing long-term ways that you solicit both kind of ideas and then kind of gauge effectiveness of certain policies from your students, and not just a one-off check a box way, but in a sustained and kind of institutionalized manner that platforms and reaches specifically students who might not always take the initiative to reach out to the administration and complain, right? Or to voice concerns. That sometimes it's the students who aren't reaching out and who aren't engaged at all that are really the ones that you have to reach out to and really solicit and hear from. But that would be what I would say.
Okay, I do want to say this, right? And I can't stress this enough. If you are an adult, male, female, I don't care what you identify as. I cannot stress this enough. A big way to help with students is speak to the student council and any upper person, like anybody over in charge of any school district. Talk to the district, talk to the board. Help, just speak to them, tell them what you think, and give a student's opinion. I don't care as long as it's something that's feasible and could get up and that everybody will agree on. Matter of fact, everybody doesn't even have to agree on it. As long as it's something that can help us. Example, if you see something with a bunch of students wanting, let's say, equipment for a team, and nobody's doing anything about it. If you're a parent student, just go talk to the board. They'll help. They'll see something about it. If you don't like how a teacher is doing something, if they're doing something wrong, talk to the board. They'll help. Whatever you can do and see, talk to the board. I promise you they'll help, because I would know. I had a principal back in elementary school who, I don't know if I'll speak on it, but I was in elementary school, I say in like the second, third grade, and I was in the principal's office with my mother, and he pushed my mother against the door and slammed the door in her face while she was trying to leave out the principal's office, well, the front office, right? And my mother went to the board, went to every chain of command from his boss, the boss over that boss, all the way to the top. And he got moved, fired. He does not work at that school at West Chatham anymore. So with that being said, talk to the board. They'll help.
Thank you both for sharing that. I think for all of us, it's really helpful to hear that, and for you to share the ways that we can sort of either take things that might seem like they're not at your pay grade and elevate it, or find other ways to elevate your voice, because that really is the role that all of us as adults and community members should be playing. So I wanted to give a chance for everyone to speak a little bit more on something that Cindy had raised, which is the need for mental health supports and concerns around mental health. And Cindy, I appreciated what you said about it being both, it can be big or small, because not everything requires a, referral to a therapist who's going to meet with a child every week and family therapy and everything else. Mental health supports in schools can also be smaller things, just like 15 minutes for social emotional learning at the beginning of the day, right? Other things like that. So what we do know is that the statistics show that even before the pandemic, unfortunately, suicidal ideation and attempts were on the rise among youth. And the data is trickling in now that the pandemic has only exacerbated that, as in so many cases. And so particularly when we think about students who are, have identities or parts of communities that have historically been excluded and pushed to the margins, and school has not been safe or home has not been safe, obviously we're really concerned about them. So just if everyone has ideas about sort of what schools, school districts, community members can do to support those students and help combat the mental health challenges that we anticipate we will see as school reopens.
I'll jump in quickly on that. I think our big picture frame is that we are all swimming in a society steeped in institutional racism, where it is all too common to label and other people instead of empathizing. And some of what Garry and Julian have really explained so brilliantly for all of us illustrates that othering of other people, that willingness that students have had, especially in a virtual world, to create bigger divisions and harm each other in ways that weren't really the way that they interacted when they were in person before. So it seems like, this is something that has always shown up at school, where Black and brown children and LGBTQ youth are all too frequently labeled bad kids. And I think the real answer lies in really steeping our professionals and our community in the training so that behaviors can be properly interpreted as communication, which is what they are. And our responses can be informed by what trauma-informed care teaches us, namely that the pertinent question we should be asking one another is, what happened to you? And then listening, and then grounding our interactions in sort of that frame and a deep understanding of that. So I think that it's very true. There's a lot of big T trauma, and there's a lot of small t trauma that folks have experienced in the last year and a half. And I think it's important for our school systems and our community at large, our parents, our teachers, all of our community settings, to really have a deep understanding of that, because it is in taking down that impulse to other and building up the empathetic connection with each other, that's the way for us to really bring about the healing that's needed.
I just want to invite those who are on the Zoom, if you want to raise your hand and join us on the panel, just let us know. You can give us a shot in the chat or the Q&A, or just raise your hand and we'll pull you on up into the panel. So we want to make sure we leave some space in this town hall for folks to join in wherever possible. But as we wait for those to raise their hand or ask us to pull them in, I wanted to shift just a little bit to what is a very real issue in school and has not disappeared during the pandemic, but there have been some decline by default. Discipline rates. Discipline rates have gone down because kids have been at home. Now, I don't know if the discipline rate went down at home, but as far as school is concerned, they were lower by default, right? Because we were mostly closed from March until when school ended, and most of the fall in most of the districts throughout Georgia. But despite those numbers drastically being reduced by default, there was a constant, and that constant is the disparity rates. Black students still are suspended and expelled, even during the pandemic, far more than their white counterparts. LGBTQ students are suspended and expelled probably at a higher rate than that. Then we have disabled students and students experiencing poverty. So why? Why are these student groups so punished, so much more punished than their white counterparts? What's behind that? And also, what can we do to improve that? And Garry and Julian, I want to add a third part to that. Aside from the why it's happening and what we can do to combat it, have you all experienced or seen an injustice that may not have happened the same way had your peer or yourself been of a dominant group or of a economically advantaged group? Give us some examples. And if y'all don't mind, I want to start with Garry and Julian on this one. I want y'all to tell us about an experience you had or something you witnessed where there was an injustice and you just didn't feel like it would have happened the same way had it been a dominant peer.
Okay, real quick before we get to that, we did have a comment saying that, what was it? As true as that is, the student has to say something to someone, which is very true. Because for our voice to be heard, we do have to speak to other people than just ourselves. And for that to be brung amongst the adults, our peers, and everybody, we would have to speak to everybody else. And to be honest, students don't speak to their teachers as much or their peers and everybody as they should about the things that are mainly needed in the school, in the classroom, than other topics.
And just to add to that, I'm going to put a charge to the adults. We got to create environments where these kids feel comfortable enough to talk to us and to tell us what's going on, because otherwise we won't know. So that is so important. Students, speak up, advocate for yourselves. If you don't feel confident in advocating, find a trusted adult so they can help you advocate for yourself. But we got to create those environments as well as the adults. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna give it back to you.
No.
But
Garry.
My father said he wants to get in.
Your dad wants to join the panel?
Yes.
Absolutely. Welcome.
Come here. You coming? Oh, he said he was just playing. Doing too much. Okay, but
They said you know.
I don't know what he's doing. Okay, but if he come in, he come in. But as I was gonna say, when you with the racial thing, I did have an occurrence where something happened to me that didn't happen to my my other counterparts, student counterparts, where there was this one time where we were in class and there was a search. No, yeah, it was technically a search, and they went around and they only went to like the Black students. They didn't go to any of the white students. They didn't check their stuff. And what they were looking for was on one of the white students, and it was a gun, and they found it after the whole search went on. And it was only because after they did the search, it was pointed out by another student. And what's it called? When it was pointed out, they went back in, they did the search, they found it, they took him to the office and everything. And then there was another time in middle school where my teacher, my main teacher, because we had two teachers in the class, right? And the actual teacher, he wasn't in class that day. And the co-teacher was in class and he was supposed to be just taking over the class, right? But there was, what he did was he had made this list. You know how most teachers make a list of students, you know, they do something, they'll get like lunch time off on lunch, they gotta sit in silent lunch, all that stuff, right? So he was making one of those lists, but every student that he put on the list was of color. He was a white teacher at that, right? Every student was of color, and the rule was you got silent lunch. And there was multiple people talking, and people that weren't of color who were talking didn't mark their names at all. He just put all the colored people. And there was about 5 or 6 of us that he put on there. And the other ones he didn't mess with. It was some people erasing their names off the board because they felt that was wrong. And what's it called? And me being me, I didn't go to the silent lunch. I left the class and I went to the cafeteria and called my grandma because she worked across to the other school. And I told her, and she said to sit in the cafeteria with one of the cafeteria ladies who she knew from, because she worked across the street, and I knew the people in the cafeteria because my grandma works for the school board. And we talked to the the teacher when she had came over there later on that day. And she had called them out about it because I had told her. And I felt that was very wrong because you had a list of people to do silent lunch, and none of them were the people who were actually talking. And my name was on the list, and I didn't even talk. The only thing I did was ask him a simple question, which was because he didn't write down the page we were supposed to be on, because this was in social studies class. And I asked him, what page were we supposed to be on? And he wrote my name down. He didn't even tell me the page. So I didn't know what to do for the work. And I got a 0 in class that day for not doing the work.
I didn't do it, but I'm sorry that you went through that, Garry. I'm sorry. Anybody
And
else?
this is the type of thing that happens all the time that people don't talk about. And let me just say, I love my teachers, but we do get some that display this behavior where he just talked about. And sometimes it can be somebody that look like you as well. We cannot dismiss that too. And it's sad because kids are punished for talking. You go on silent lunch, it almost make you think about this school to prison pipeline. Like, you wear a uniform, you stand in line, you be quiet, and it's always listen, listen, listen. And the children are never able to express themselves. Sorry that you went through that, Garry, because that's so disheartening. But in all fairness, what he's explained happen all the time, especially to Black students, and thinking that we're going back in person, and we have mask mandated for some areas. Will Black and brown children or poor kids, will they be punished for not having on a mask or funneling the mask and taking it off? We got to understand how uncomfortable that can be for 6 to 8 hours. And I think we got an extra 30 minutes of school given the because we're like, we had this deficit of student learning loss is the term. We got an extra 30 minutes in school. So just imagine sitting in class having a mask on. And I'm not against masks. I want everybody to stay safe. But will our children be punished for not having on the mask, taking it off, trying to let it down so they can breathe, or just taking a break? That truly concerns me as a mom. And given I just graduated a pandemic son who was diagnosed with ADHD, and it was hard for him to stay still. And I had to really home in on the teachers, the principal, to make sure that we wrapped everything possible around him so he wouldn't fall through the cracks, and he would graduate on time. And I have him and his teachers and the principal to thank for that, because I know it was hard. It was hard for him. I know it was even harder given that he was online. He couldn't see his friends. He always wanted to go out and see them. And I got COVID. I did, and I was severely sick. And so I take it so serious. And I'm afraid that kids going back in person with these mandates in some areas, but not other, could be punished. And I hope we keep lifting it up so we don't see, those experiences where the suspension rate go up and in school suspension and so forth.
I think one of the one things that we need to do to address the disparity is get rid of resource officers in public schools. I don't.
Very true.
Yep.
But I know how you said about your son being diagnosed with with ADHD. I have ADHD and dyslexia dysgraphia. And what's it called? That really interferes with how I learn and my movement. So I move around a lot and I talk a lot because it keeps me in check. But I do a lot of moving around the day, and also the dyslexia messes with my handwriting. So a lot of the stuff I write isn't legible to teachers, but like my mother could read it and stuff. But to teachers, some of the time they won't even look at what I write. So what I had to do, I got an IEP. If you have dyslexia, ADHD, you should get it, or any form of, any, disability, you should get a IEP, and that's another form. I forgot what it's called. But that's a very
504.
yeah, the 504 plan. Yeah, that. You should really look into getting one of those to talk to your counselor and your doctor and everything. But that is something that is very important to have, because that has you set with certain things throughout the school. Like you get extra time on testing. There's you have for all tests. That's even state tests, regular school tests. You get extra time on work. You have a teacher to help you that has a lot of good things that come with it. And another thing about the mask mandates, Chatham County is optional for mask mandates, and they're not forcing it, but they are saying you should, but it's optional. You don't have to, you can, but yeah. And then another thing I wanted to talk about was the school bus, the transportation thing, because they are saying that there's going to be a lack of transportation and certain students won't be able to take the bus now, which is something that I found very interesting on how that's going to work, because a lot of students require taking the bus, and that's going to hold up more traffic if a lot of parents, if a lot of parents are on the road, yeah, and if a lot of parents are on the road,
Like yourself.
yes, like me, because they did send my parents a form saying that I won't be able to take the school bus, which is gonna now I gotta figure out how I'm gonna be able to get to school and talk. We gotta talk to the school about that. But that's something that was really important that I wanted to say. Also, we got some questions that we should go over in a minute.
I want to lift something up before we go further. If you have an IEP, it can be written in your IEP, because my son, I have 3 kids with IEP. It can be written that transportation be included
Yes,
in your IEP, and by law they have to honor that.
It's supposed to be 100%, and that's where I was confused about with that part. Yes.
It's an individualized program that should be designed for every child in mind based on their needs. And I'm so glad that they have a great program for you, Garry. Right quick, before we hear from Christina and get some closing thoughts from the panel, I just wanted to acknowledge Wanda with the question about House Bill 855 at Georgia Appleseed. For over a year, we have been working on building some recommendations for the Georgia Department of Ed and the State Board of Education that we've submitted. And we can, along with the resources going out after this, send out an overview of the House Bill 855, but just know that districts are hard at work to figure out how best to implement this new trauma assessment process for kids in care. And we'll send some follow-up information on that when we're done.
Well, as we suspected, we have run out of time before we ran out of questions. And we so appreciate all of the panelists being here tonight. So I'm going to open it up for sort of each of your closing thoughts, maybe sort of, a way that everyone tuning in tonight can get involved in social justice, whatever takeaway you want to leave everyone with. But what I did want to say is I think for all of us who are in this work and sort of living and breathing it on a regular basis, it is really, really easy to get disheartened. And being able to just listen to all of you and all of the amazing work that you're doing tonight was really, for me, was like filling my cup, right? Because it's nice to know that you're not in it alone and that everybody out there is really or a lot of people out there are really working to move things in the right direction. And we can, like Wykeisha said, if we're not siloed, if we work together, we can actually make a lot of impact. So I just personally want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight and for sharing everything that you've shared. So yeah, sort of a final closing thought, action item, whatever you want folks to take away with. And maybe we can just go in the order that we did initially. So, and I'll kind of direct to people. So, and that way we will end with Garry and Julian as we started. So Wykeisha, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say the main takeaway, if you truly want to help a child and impact them, you must help their family. That we have seen over the last 20 years, I just reviewed some documents with the same data. We're in the same spot from 20 years ago. If you really want to see some impact for the youth, you got to work with the parents. There's no way we can continue to tiptoe around it, and we have to stop working in silos. And I'm here to support all parents in Atlanta and in Georgia.
Great, thank you. I think Cindy, you were next.
Yeah, so I think that the number one thing is we recognize that we're working with a system that has been based on inequity and just calling it for what it is, white supremacy, right? We're working to reform systems, tear down systems, improve systems, get resources. And the way that we do that is by continuously showing up. Big ways to show up right now. We've already talked about attending your Board of Education meetings. Local redistricting is going on right now, and Julian might kill me because I might be stealing some of his thunder, but showing up to these state meetings, showing up to, because we're not just having state meetings, the local, like the county municipals, they're having meetings on their level, and that's where your school districts are going to be decided. Just continuously showing up is going and using your voice, even if it squeaks, even if you're not quite sure what you're saying, even if you stumble over your words, using your voice, because the number one thing that we know is making sure that they know that we're paying attention and that we're speaking into the work they're doing. That's what really, really changes things. That's what's going to get the resources that the schools need. That's what's going to get the curriculum that our kids need. That's all of the things. So show up, use your voice. And I apologize for my dog's continuous use theirs.
Christina?
Yeah, I think that in closing, I would just like to echo Sarah's observations. I found the comments from Julian and Garry to be really inspirational and really uplifting. It's really, really incredible to hear from them and what their thoughts are, what they're working on, and just have a chance to learn from their experiences. I mean, I think in closing, one of the big things that we can all commit to as a society is to look at all of our children as if they're our own children or children in our own family systems. And I think one of the things that we see in representing classes of children in child welfare systems is that people think about them as other people's children. And instead, really our society should commit to looking at every single one of them as if they are our own. In order to get engaged with children's rights and get updates from us, you can visit us at www.childrensrights.org and sign up to get updates on things and be connected. And but I think really the key to coming through this moment as our society is really not othering anyone, but really seeing that we're all quite connected.
Julian or Garry, whichever one of you wants to share first.
Okay. All right. My biggest takeaway from this is what I say. I'm gonna say this again, just in case y'all didn't hear me the first time. Speak to the board. Students, we do need a way for students to have more of an open area and someone to really talk to. Because a lot of the time, the people that we talk to will tell the stuff that we don't want them to talk about. But we do, a good thing to do is talk to the board, talk to anybody over somebody. Go for it. I don't care if you go to the president of the school, talk to somebody important. Everybody's important, but talk to somebody that's up there, because the higher you go, it's the higher that you get. So if you want the best results, go straight to the board. I'm telling you, it'll happen. You could email them, you could go there yourself. You can even just write them a letter and send it off there. They'll see it.
All right, Julian.
Yeah, just to echo what Gary and Cindy said, like, show up, like, just show up. That is like hands down the most important thing. And whether it's talking to the school board, whether it is your municipal government, whether it's your state representatives, your federal representatives, your voice is far more impactful, I think, than a lot of people realize. And especially when we're talking about people like who sit on a school board or even in the state house who don't hear from constituents all that often, talking to them has a massively outsized impact, and showing that you're paying attention and that you speak for a certain segment of the population, either if you're a student leader or a parent who is speaking on behalf of other concerned parents, or whoever you are, showing that you speak for a community that holds values of equity and representation, and communicating that to people who are accountable to you electorally and democratically is hands down one of the best things that you can do. And if all of us did that, we would be in a very, very perhaps different place than we are today. And it's something that we can all kind of strive towards kind of in the future. But definitely just show up and pay attention.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for that. And thank you again so much for participating tonight. This has been an incredible conversation. LaShonda, is there anything you'd like to say to close us out?
We just hope to see you on next Thursday at 12 noon. We'll make sure you get those links again via the follow-up email. If you did not register through Zoom, you can email us at info@gaappleseed.org, and we'll make sure you get those invites. Please visit all of our websites. We'll make sure we get all that information to you. This has been a panel full of social justice advocates, and we are excited to see the work that's coming in the future, and we're excited to get you involved. So stay in touch with us, and thank you, and see you soon.
Give yourselves a round of applause.
Fabulous, you all. Just fabulous.
Absolutely.